Welcome to the Sports Bar Life. I'm your host, Sri Visawasam. Thank you for tuning in. The Sports Bar Life is home to your major event sporting coverage. Today is our 8th episode and follows our previous show, which focused on boxing, where we spoke to former two-time world champion Paulie Malignaggi for over 40 minutes. If you missed it, check it out when you have a minute. Our other guest on our previous show, Jarrett Hurd, was successful in defending his IBF junior middleweight title following the show, so congratulations to Jarrett on his first world title defense. This week, we move our attention to rugby league, where this week we'll see the commencement of the 2017 Rugby League World Cup. This will be the 15th edition of the Rugby League World Cup, where this time it is being held across 3 countries, Australia, New Zealand and Papua New Guinea, who'll share co-hosting of the tournament. So today we'll provide you with all you need to know on the biggest event in international rugby league, and to do so, joining us today on the show are 2 of the game's most respected journalists. We'll first chat to Josh Massoud, Chief Rugby Reporter for Channel 7, who are the Australian television host broadcaster of the event, and he'll provide his take on the tournament as a whole and amongst a wide range of topics, give us an insight into how the Kangaroos will shape up and what you'll see on Channel 7 with their coverage. We then head to New Zealand and chat to David Long, Chief Rugby Writer for Fairfax in Auckland, and David will give us a feel for the buzz in New Zealand leading into the World Cup, and in particular the key talking points surrounding the Kiwis. Before we start, to keep up to date with the Sports Bar Life, make sure you subscribe to the show on the platform you're listening to this program. We are on iTunes, YouTube and more. Also, if you have clicked on the link through our Twitter and Facebook pages at Sports Bar Life, don't forget to hit the follow button to keep up to date with all our future episodes. We now chat to our first guest, Josh Massoud of Channel 7. Great for you to join us, Josh. Thanks for being on the show today.
Yeah, no worries, Trey. It's a pleasure.
Fantastic. So, the World Cup kicks off this Friday night in Melbourne with Australia taking on England. What can you say is the buzz leading up to the first game of the tournament?
Oh, it's certainly been helped by some really high-profile defections from 2 of the major countries, Australia and New Zealand, to Tonga, which is a second-tier country, no doubt, and a country that's never really shone on the world level. So the first one that shocked the rugby league world was Jason Taumalolo declining to play for the Kiwis and backflipping and saying he's going to play for Tonga. And then the even bigger possibly was Andrew Fafita walking away from a Kangaroos jersey to play for Tonga as well, to join him just a day later. Now, the big thing about these 2 defections, Sri, is that for either Australia or New Zealand, these players get paid a guaranteed $50,000 for the length of the tournament, whether they play 1 minute or whether they play every minute. For Tonga, they get paid $30 a day. So they're doing this for love of their native country rather than money, and it's created a huge talking point for the tournament.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's funny you mentioned that because we spoke to David Long of Fairfax in Auckland, and he also said that particularly the Jason Taumalolo defection to Tonga was pretty much what's caused all the buzz of, or the talk about the Rugby League World Cup. Do you think that's a good thing?
Oh, look, any publicity is good publicity. So if you're looking at it from a purely promotional point of view, it is a good thing. I think if cynics want to take shots at it, they've probably got a little bit of justification, because from the outside, when you're coming from established world sports like soccer and cricket and whatnot, they think it's rather ridiculous that people can chop and change between countries. But rugby league is what it is. It's a developing sport. It's only really got 3 strong nations. And if you're going to have a viable tournament like this, then you need to bend the rules to adequately to make it competitive, and you need to spread the talent. And these players originally would have played for Australia or New Zealand, but in their hearts, they clearly want to play for Tonga, and there was a couple of other players who play in the NRL that joined them as well. So they're going to have a really good team, a good, strong team, and it's created a talking point. So, yeah, I think overall it's a good thing.
Okay, yeah. With Tonga and the two additions, what sort of difference would that make to a side by having two high-level NRL players in their national side?
Oh, ridiculous. I mean, ridiculous. Jason Taumalolo, Dally M medalist, 2016. He didn't win it in 2017, but I actually thought he played better this year than he did last year. So he's easily Rugby League's premier forward, the best forward in the entire sport, playing for Tonga for $30 a day. Then you look at Andrew Fafita, what he's done. He won the grand final for the Cronulla Sharks in 2016 with an amazing try. And then he backed it up with what many believe was the best origin performance from a prop forward ever in game one this year. He's a big stage player. So those two alone, they're just pure match winners. And you don't get a lot of match winners playing in the middle of the field in the forwards. They're usually your halfbacks or your fullbacks or your 5'8" and whatnot. So they're going to make a massive difference. Just the aura they carry with them, what they'll bring to especially the players, probably the bottom five players for Tonga who probably don't play regular first grade, who play in the lower levels either on their island themselves or in Sydney or Brisbane. It'll just give them such a huge buzz when they run out alongside these two giants of rugby league to think that they can really achieve what no one expects them to do.
Yeah. Now, it's going to be pretty interesting to see when they take the field. Looking at the groups, we've got 14 teams, 2 groups of 4, where 3 teams qualify, and then 2 groups of 3 where 1 team qualifies to the quarterfinals. What are your thoughts on the structure of the tournament?
Yeah, look, there's probably too many teams. I think it's safe to say. I don't think there's enough depth to cater for 14 teams. It really does drop off once you get beyond Australia, New Zealand, England, and the Pacific nations. Papua New Guinea are quite strong again, which is good to see. But when you go to some of the smaller countries in Britain, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, look very vulnerable to me with only limited NRL talent available to them. And then the USA, I cover rugby league for a living, and I'll put my hand up and I struggle to recognise any names in that squad as well. So it's sort of like a mismatch in boxing a little bit, sort of a little bit worried for the outcome. You wonder whether it will be doing the game justice if we see some huge scorelines in these matches. So that's why they've structured the tournament as they have. So those pools of 3 you mentioned where only one team goes through, actually the weaker teams are in those pools. They get to play against each other. So you're looking for, as much competitive games as possible in the early stages of the tournament to keep that interest up. There might be a couple of blowouts when they meet the stronger teams in the quarterfinals, though.
Yeah. So with Australia, Group A, you've got England, France, and Lebanon. How do you view Australia and their and how they're going to go in Group A?
I can't see anything but Australia going through the tournament undefeated, to be honest. They're just such a strong team. Look, there's some holes. Jonathan Thurston being out, best player in history, some would say. Can't replace him. Very difficult task. Then they're missing Fafita. We've spoken about that before. And Matt Scott as well. So virtually they're starting front row plus the best player in the world, their halfback. So there are some holes, but the depth Australia has to call upon is still ridiculous. I would even maybe argue their second, perhaps their third team would go close to winning this tournament. The reason why I write off England, they've got some great top-line NRL players in the Burgess boys, in James Graham and Gareth Widdop, but it falls away very quickly after that. And all the reports I get from England are that the game in England isn't really going ahead in leaps and bounds. In fact, quite the opposite. It's had difficulties in money. It's had some great clubs like Bradford really hit the wall, which you would never think if the game was going strongly that would happen. And hopefully it doesn't. Hopefully this tournament doesn't expose the gulf between the two nations and that England are competitive. But I just can't see them, even with Wayne Bennett at their side, competing with Australia. So I see Australia going through, in first, England in second, and then the game in Canberra this Sunday, Lebanon, France will determine the third country. And yeah, France have got some injuries. They're missing a lot of players from the Catalans, I think about half a dozen, so they're going to miss that experience.
And Lebanon, they've got Robbie Farah captaining the side, and a lot of the Lebanese players are from Australia. How do you view their chances?
Oh, I think they're one of the better teams. I think they'd beat a lot of the teams I mentioned before that I'm quite concerned about quite easily. So you throw Robbie Farah, Tim Manor, Michael Leisha, and Mitchell Moses, who had a great season at the back end with Parramatta. That's a very handy foundation. Yeah, again, it does fall away a little bit. They'll be relying on reserve graders and players from the lower tier in Sydney and Brisbane. There's actually only one fair income Lebanese player who's flown here in that squad of 24. He'll probably only get limited game time. But I think what they'll do with this tournament is pull crowds. They have an extremely passionate fan base. I remember back in the mid-90s, I don't know if many of your listeners would remember this, but there was a tournament called the World Sevens that was staged, and Lebanon actually had a team in it at the Sydney Football Stadium. And for their games, there'd be 30,000 fans, 20,000 of which were screaming Lebanese fans with drums, creating a fantastic atmosphere. And once they finished playing, the stadium was deserted. That's the passion they bring, and they're playing two of their games in Sydney, where the majority of their fan base is. And it's great to see them, and it's great to see those high-profile NRL players turn out for them. You know, if they can beat France, they'll go through the quarterfinals, and they'll get another game, and hopefully they'll get a lot of support. They're very colourful, and Sheree, they've got one of the greats, Brad Fittler, coaching them as well, who's, of course, pretty much auditioning for the New South Wales State of Origin job as well through this tournament, so that creates another layer of intrigue.
Yeah, for sure. It'll certainly be exciting to see them play, and that France game will be important. With Group B, you've got New Zealand, who are probably expected to go through as the top team, and then the other three teams, you've got Scotland, Samoa, and Tonga. How do you view the hopes of those four sides to progress?
Yeah, well, and the big game, isn't it, is New Zealand and Tonga in Hamilton. There's going to be a lot of bad blood there between the Kiwi players and Taumalolo after what he's done. The Kiwi coach, David Kibble, has made no secret of the fact that he was very disappointed with the way Jason Taumalolo went about his business. There was a media day yesterday. I asked him, what are Jason Taumalolo's chances of being selected ever again for the Kiwis? He said, that's not up to me. That's going to be a decision for the playing group and our nation. So that doesn't probably fill you with hope that he'll be wearing a Kiwi jersey ever again after this. They are quite hurt by this, and there's a lot of pride in that Kiwi jersey, and that it's been dented over the last 12 months since Kibble took the role, and he acknowledges that disappointing in the Four Nations, disappointing in the Anzac Test. And then the aftermath to that, where their captain, Jesse Bromwich and Proctor, two of their senior players, being captured on film, accepting what seemed to be cocaine off a man at 5 a.m. in the morning. Not a great look. Banned from the tournament. So it's just been one disaster to the next for the Kiwis. And yeah, all their games are interesting. I mean, you look at the Scotland game and think they've got to win that, but then you remember the Four Nations last year, they drew with Scotland. So their form lines coming into this aren't great. And Kibble has taken some quite interesting measures to get them back on track. He had a team camp in New Zealand last week, and basically the players slept on the floor on mattresses. They got back to their roots. They had to cook for themselves. They slept in a big room all together. There was some snoring. They stayed awake. It was a few grumbles on the first day, but by the end of it, he said they're tighter than ever now. And we'll see how tight they are when they come up against Samoa and Tonga, who both some very handy players. Samoa also, let's not forget the likes of BJ Leilua and Joseph Paulo, two players that most people, also Junior Paulo from the Canberra Raiders, two players that most people thought might have made their State of Origin debuts by now.
Yeah. Well, with New Zealand playing their games in New Zealand, they won't have to come to Australia till most likely the final. Do you like the structure of having the competition across the three nations, being Australia, New Zealand, and Papua New Guinea?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you have to fish where the fish are. I think if you had New Zealand playing Tonga in Penrith, you'd get a decent crowd. You're not going to be looking at 25 or 30,000 what you might get in New Zealand. No, they should definitely, if the opportunity is there to play before their people, they should do that. And as you mentioned, Papua New Guinea, that's so exciting. I was there last month for the Prime Minister's 13 game. That stadium is an amazing stadium there in Port Moresby. It puts the stadia in Sydney, suburban Sydney, to shame. It is a beautiful boutique stadium, something you wouldn't expect from a town like Port Moresby maybe, but 13,000, 14,000 people there going absolutely berserk. No people love their rugby league like the Papua New Guineans, and the atmosphere there will be tremendous. How could you knock back the opportunity to do that?
Yeah, for sure. That's going to be awesome. Well, with the Group C and D, which are largely filled of the emerging nations, are there any key players that we could look out in those two groups?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, you look at Italy. You've got James Tedesco playing at fullback, who was very, very unlucky not to be picked for the Kangaroos, voted as the player of the year by his peers this year. So he would have had fair claims on a Kangaroos jersey, and he couldn't make it. And that indicates the depth that Australia have got. So he's playing for Italy. Then you've got Paul Vaughan, who was also close to selection for the Kangaroos in the front row. Mark Minicello, a veteran who's been playing in England and got good NRL experience. Nathan Brown from the Parramatta Eels, who had a fantastic season this year, won their club award for Player of the Year. So they boast a really, really handy lineup, the Italians. And then look at Fiji, Jared Hayne. Who would have thought, 3 years ago when Jared Hayne won the Dally M medal and set off on his odyssey over to America and became a household name all across Australia, that he'd be back in the humble roots of Fiji, unable to make the Australian team, having returned to rugby league. He's got a lot to prove, Jared Hayne, after a pretty disappointing 2017 with both the Blues and the Titans. So, yeah, there's a lot of intrigue in those teams, I think, and the Papuans as well. Like, they boast 10 players from the Hunters who won their Intrust Cup final, and that cohesion, that's not replicated from any of the other 13 teams, even Australia. There's only 7 Melbourne Storm players, and they won't all be on the field at the same time in any one given game. So each team has to learn to play together in a very short space of time. The Papuans have that advantage where they have all those combinations, and I think that'll prove very handy.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Looking at the Kangaroos, and when you look at the respective teams in origin, New South Wales and Queensland, in terms of that cohesion that you're referring to there with Papua New Guinea, how would you compare the Kangaroos' synergy as opposed to the origin sides?
Well, they'll be looking to replicate quite a lot of it. So you're guaranteed to have Billy Slater at 1. You're guaranteed to have Cooper Cronk at 7. You're guaranteed to have Cameron Smith at 9. That's your spine, your nerve centre of the entire team. Now, who goes into 6? Well, Cameron Munster's in the squad as well, so he could replicate the Queensland and Melbourne Storm spine, and there's great cohesion right there from the very start. However, Michael Morgan, he's the spanner in the works, isn't he? A tremendous back end of the season for the Cowboys, the form player of the finals, easily the form player of the finals. And it sounds like he's going to get the nod for the number 6 jersey against England. Make no mistake, that will be Australia's strongest team. Mal Meninga will send out. That's the top 17. And where does that leave Cameron Munster? Maybe to stake his claim next weekend against France. So if they go with that, there's at least 3 players from the Storm, so there's cohesion there. Around the back line, well, Dugan and Chambers have played together in the centres before for Australia. The wings, both Holmes has played, but Gagai hasn't. And Dane Gagai, well, he deserves a debut after his tremendous form with Queensland. So a lot of these guys have played together quite a bit, but I think as long as you've got that spine, then the rest of it rolls off the back of that, and that the brilliant 3, the big 3 from Melbourne, will, they're the ones that hold the key for Australia, and they're the ones that probably hold the key as to who plays number 6. Obviously, Cameron Smith has a big say in selection, so it'll be interesting what the discussion is tonight. The team to be named at 4 p.m. on Tuesday.
Okay. So not too far away. And as far as your predictions for the tournament, you did refer to them at the beginning of our conversation. Who would you say are the top 4 teams, and then who would you say you're an expected grand finalist and winner?
The top 4 teams, I'd go with Australia, England, New Zealand, and Tonga. I think they're the top 4 teams. I'm sorry, Sherry, I haven't done the permutations and combinations, whether those 4 can actually make it through to the semi-final due to the format. But if if they do, I think that'd be definitely the strongest four teams on paper. Depending on the way the draw opens up, and I'd have to sit down and look at how it's set out. I like the Papua New Guineans. I think they could create a little bit of a shock and get to a semi-final. We've seen Fiji do it in the past two tournaments when no one really would have predicted it. In 2013, what's more, they didn't have Jared Hayne. He was playing for Australia as well. So this tournament has provided a surprise for the Final Four, and I think they'd be the ones to do it because of that cohesion. And they've got some other handy NRL players as well on their side in David Mead, their captain, Kurt Baptiste, who adds a lot at hooker when he comes on the field, and James Seguiaro, a similar role. He plays for the Sharks. He's quite a live wire when he comes on the field. I think the Papuans with that home ground advantage should go through undefeated in their group. Just be a matter then if they can knock off one of the tall poppies in the quarterfinal.
Okay, I get you. And so who would you think would make the grand final?
I still think Australia will make it. New Zealand have a big advantage because they can stay at home the whole way through, provided they top their group. If they don't top their group, they'll have to come to Australia for a quarterfinal, and that's where it could prove quite tricky. But yeah, it's a tough one now. Tonga, with those two players, you'd think they could cause some problems, but then you look at them in the halves, and they do look a little short. Will Hopewadi will have to do a lot of ball playing at fullback. So, look, I'm going to stick with New Zealand, but yeah, England could make life interesting too. However, I don't like the permutation of England having to go to New Zealand for a semi-final. So if that happens, I'm going to back the Kiwis.
And so if Australia...
If you got any sense out of that, I'm sorry. I'll get the splinters out of my bum. I'm backing a few each way there, aren't I?
No, I reckon you've positioned it well. So if Australia did play New Zealand in the grand final, how would you think they would match up?
Oh, I couldn't see anything but an Australian win again. They did it 4 years ago, won I think 34-2 very comprehensively. Last year's Four Nations was another easy win, and then the Anzac Test. So Mal Meninga, when the Kangaroos were having a few issues, 2 or 3 years ago when New Zealand were winning quite heavily, I don't think there was that passion or desire in the Kangaroos jersey. You had a lot of players pulling out, and they were really beating themselves. That's what was happening. There just wasn't the desire to play for the Kangaroos. The desire was more origin, club, then get my body right. And if it suits me and if it's convenient, all right, I'll play for the Kangaroos. But Mal Meninga has changed all that completely. He's got a motivated, passionate, enthusiastic group now, more enthusiastic than I've ever seen throughout my career reporting on the game. So, yeah, I think they're unbeatable.
And you being with Channel 7, what will your involvement be over the course of the tournament?
After the game, similar to what you see on Fox, there'll be like a magazine show, a wraparound show. So a half an hour preview, half an hour post-match, and we'll have segments live from the ground or from the studio before and after the game, hopefully with a few interviews as well. So I'll be coordinating that, but mostly from live at the ground.
Okay, fantastic. So in terms of the broadcast, Channel 7 will be showing all games live?
From what I understand, all games, I'm not too sure about the Lebanon-France game. I think that might be on delay from a document I saw. So because there's a bit of a time clash there with the doubleheader this weekend, this Sunday, so that might be on delay. But apart from that, yes, all games will be live either on the main 7 channel or on one of the secondary digital channels.
Okay. And what are your thoughts on the games basically being spread across the weekend rather than having games throughout the weekdays as well?
Look, I'm a traditionalist maybe. I actually don't like the NRL being spread over 4 days. I find that the rounds sort of morph into one another and you forget when the weekend is. I think weekends are for sport and weekdays are for looking forward to sport. And by the time you get to them, you really want to watch it. When it's on all the time, I think we take it for granted a bit. And I think we see that in declining attendances at stadiums. And I think we can get footballed out a little bit. So, yeah, having it on every night of the week, plus the challenges that would present to get people there on school nights and work nights, I don't think that's the right way to go. So, no, I think they've nailed it. It's a dead time of the year in Australia for sport. There's nothing really competing against this tournament. so it can have the weekends to itself as well. It doesn't need to go to prime time on weeknights. So, yeah, I think they've got that right.
Oh, that's good. And in terms of the length of the tournament being around 5 weeks, do you think that the engagement within the fans will continue for that extended period of time?
Yeah, that's a weakness for sure, and that's what happens when you have so many teams, 14 teams. I mean, if the Soccer World Cup goes for less time, 1 week less, 4 weeks, I think. But the difference is, of course, soccer players can back up within 3 or 4 days, whereas rugby league's a much more physically grueling sport, and you need at least a week's recovery. Or 5 days, even these days, is deemed not enough. So, yeah, from a practical perspective, with 14 teams, there's not really much else you can do. And if there's some blowouts in the first couple of games, then it might prove difficult to keep attention spans going for the whole length of the tournament. I agree, it's not ideal, 5 weeks, for a sport where really most people think there's only 3 life chances.
Okay, yeah. And just to learn a bit more about yourself, Josh, what other sports are you interested in or are involved with from a media perspective?
Well, I used to follow quite a lot of them in my previous incarnation. I worked as a newspaper journalist at the Daily Telegraph, so I covered tennis, golf, boxing, went overseas to cover a lot of those sports, Olympic Games. But since I joined Seven, I joined it on the basis of being the chief rugby league reporter. So that's pretty much what I do full time. I could pretty much count on one hand over the last 3 years, stories that I've done that aren't rugby league. So yeah, it's definitely, the focus is on rugby league, and it's a great thrill. That's why to have this tournament as the host broadcaster, because for the rest of the time we're the outsiders looking in with, of course, Channel 9 and Fox having the rights. And it's difficult from a media perspective because the non-rights holders aren't allowed in dressing rooms, probably don't get the inside running on a lot of the interviews and the stories. So this is a nice change.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, it will be great to see you on TV to cover all this. Certainly, from a Melbourne's perspective, we don't really get that much rugby coverage. We certainly have the Channel 9, and then there's obviously Fox. But to get the depth that you've explained to us will certainly be great for us here in Melbourne as well.
Yeah, I always got a lot of time for the game in Melbourne and people that show interest in it. It's been great over the last 20 years to see what the Storm have done down here. Every time I go to the Storm games, with each passing year, the crowd gets a little bit bigger. It gets a little bit more knowledgeable. It gets a little bit more passionate. And now they've got a good 15,000, 16,000 rusted on fans who are true rugby league fans, and that's a great achievement for a sport that doesn't have the money and the resources that the AFL has. What you see, what it's doing in Sydney, the Swans 30 years ago, the Giants now. The money it pours into schools and communities behind the scenes, even though the Giants are criticised for not getting big crowds. Don't you worry, that will come in 20 years. People are very simple if they think the AFL will cut and run on that one. That's a winning strategy, but they've got the money behind them. League doesn't have those type of resources, so it's a credit to the Storm, I think, themselves, for the way they promote the game in Melbourne, and I'm always glad to do that, because let's not forget there's an N at the start of NRL, and that means national, and we can't be too inward looking in Sydney.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and yeah, before we go, what's the best way for our listeners to keep in contact online, and how they can engage with you?
Yeah, I'm pretty active on Twitter, so just at Josh Massoud, Josh _ Massoud, all lowercase. You can ask me whatever you like, or shoot me an email at jmassoud@7.com.au, all lowercase again. And yeah, I'd be delighted to answer any questions or give any advice on how to follow the tournament or just rugby league in general.
Fantastic. Well, it's certainly been great to chat to you today with all your insight. I'm sure our listeners will be even more interested in following the Rugby League World Cup when it kicks off this weekend. And we thank you for your time.
Good on you, Shree. Enjoyed it, mate.
Terrific to hear from Josh. We'll sure see a lot of him over the next 5 weeks on our TV screens. It will be interesting to see how Papua New Guinea go as well, and will be nice to see their packed crowds in Port Moresby. Let's now head across the Tasman to speak to our next guest, David Long of New Zealand's biggest news website, stuff.co.nz. Thanks for joining us, David. It's great to have you on the show.
No problem at all. It's good to be here.
Excellent. So, the Rugby League World Cup kicks off this weekend, and New Zealand are one of the host countries, along with Australia and Papua New Guinea. What is the buzz like in New Zealand ahead of the tournament?
Well, up until a few weeks ago, I'd be surprised if many people actually knew the Rugby League World Cup was going on. But then all of a sudden, Jason Taumalolo decided he was going to play for Tonga, and then everybody in the country, whether you cared about league or whether you cared about sport, knew about the tournament and had an opinion on what had happened, really. So, in some ways, Taumalolo's done an awful lot of good for the Rugby League World Cup in New Zealand by making this stock decision and sort of raising awareness of it.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I guess with this tournament, we have seen some other players were playing for other countries, I guess. What is the take on that? Do you feel that it's better for the tournament for the talent to be spread a bit more?
I think it's a sort of horses for courses sort of situation, really. I can understand some players, not wanting to choose to play for the island, but other players, I feel should have been playing for New Zealand at this World Cup. Like, for example, Jason Taumalolo, born in Auckland, grew up in Auckland, and then moved to Australia. Yeah, he's got Tongan parents, but he's a Kiwi with a Kiwi accent and a Kiwi passport, and he should have been playing for New Zealand. And I think it's pretty outrageous what he did. On the other hand, a guy like David Fusatua, who's also born in Auckland, he's sort of on the fringes of the Rugby League World Cup, and he didn't really sort of know. He didn't get much of an indication going into the selection whether he'd be picked for the Kiwis, or if he did get picked, whether he'd be playing very much, or sort of one of the guys who's on the bench or doesn't get to appear very much. So for him to play for Tonga, I can understand that he's going to have a lot more impact in the World Cup and be a lot more involved than if he did play for the Kiwis.
Yeah. That's an interesting take. I guess if you're not sure that you're going to be picked for, say, New Zealand, and you have a chance to play for a country of your background, then I guess that way it has a bit more of a meaning that in changing sides.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there were stories about, wasn't there, about Isaac Luke looking to play for Ireland at the World Cup, but not quite getting it organised in time. And, and this is a festival of the sport. There's not the Rugby League World Cup is not a sort of a tournament that's been, showered in success over the years. But you want to see the best players in the sport, in the tournament, and whatever way you can sort of bend the rules or whatever to get them all in there. I understand that, that's why you look at the sides like Lebanon and Scotland, and James Bell from the Warriors, who's in that side as well. He's probably never been to Scotland in his life, but you understand that to get these sort of good guys in the tournament. But it's when someone like Taumalolo, that's the sort of thing that doesn't please me as much, to see someone sort of do that, and for FIDA as well, really, to sort of turn their back on the country where they grew up on and play for another nation. That's not so good, I don't think. With
the tournament, as you mentioned earlier, that it hasn't been considered one of the premier world events in sport. With where we are now, after having so many tournaments which have been dominated by Australia in the most part, do you feel that this time around we're going to see a bit more of more contenders within the tournament?
No, I don't think so. I think Australia should be still way ahead of everybody else. I was at the final 4 years ago in Manchester, and everyone was sort of looking at how competitive the Kiwis could have been in that final, and they just got blown out of the water. It was a horrible final. It was just so one-sided, and I think I don't know whether England, it could be England or the Kiwis who get to play them in the final, but I'd imagine Australia will still sort of be way too good for anybody else. What hopefully we might get at this World Cup is, though, if you think back to 4 years, and Australia played Fiji in the semi-final at Wembley, and they just absolutely destroyed them. And that's the problem, is that there's just 3 decent teams, and you hope that with the way that Samoa are now better, and obviously with Tonga, with their players that they've been able to get in, that there is a viable sort of fourth nation now in the World Cup, because you don't want a 3-team World Cup is a waste of time. At least with 4, you've got 2 decent semi-finals, and I sort of hope we'll get that this time.
Yeah. Let's hope so. In terms of the other nations competing with the big 3, so to speak, what are the challenges from, say, a positional standpoint that makes it hard for these other nations to compete with those teams?
Yeah. I think if you look at the forward packs, of the Pacific Island teams, they've all got huge guys in there, and a lot of them have got very quick wings. I sort of say maybe in the halves of some of them teams, that's where they could be lacking, and Urca, whether that's where this is more of a sort of struggle, and also depth as well. Even though that Australia have got so many players that they could have picked on, and so have England, and even with the Kiwis, with the players who got missing, there's still a lot of very good players who've missed out. But some of the smaller teams, if they lose, if Scotland lose Danny Brough, for example, or that's really going to sort of absolutely hinder their chances completely of being competitive.
So with the structure of the tournament, there is now 4 pools with 2 groups of 4 teams and 2 groups of 3 teams, with groups A and B having 3 go through to this next round, whereas with Group C and D having the winner of the 2 3-team groups go into the quarterfinals. Do you feel that this structure seeks to address any mismatches that we would probably get in another structure?
Yeah, I think it's a very, when you look at it, it's a very complex sort of system that we have. I look at other World Cups, and it's all the teams are seeded in top team in each pool and that sort of stuff. So, but yeah, I think it's a very clever way that it's done. I think so that you get the big match first of all between England and Australia, and that sort of defines whoever loses that. You should end up playing New Zealand in the semi-final, and you do get a lot less, really big mixed matches where you can get 100 points put on the side, which is no good to anybody really. And I went at the last World Cup. You go into some of the smaller games, in some small towns, when you see some of these little teams have a really competitive game against each other. You look at USA at the last World Cup, who had some fantastic games in Scotland. And I think that's sort of a part of a festival of rugby league is to see these little teams have competitive games and win against some other little teams. Not to put them down at all, but I think that's part of the sort of what makes the World Cup special, is seeing some of the smaller nations being out there and having good wins.
Yeah. I guess when we looking also at the Rugby Union World Cup last year, we saw Japan beat South Africa. Do you feel that there is a chance for one of those second-tier teams to spring an upset?
Well, I guess the one that people would look at is Tonga against the Kiwis in Hamilton in the last pool game. And there's a lot of attention over here towards that game, and clearly because of what's happened. The Kiwis are trying to sort of think, well, let's focus on Samoa and Scotland first, and we don't want to be talking about that game yet. But it is a big game, and clearly if you've got Jason Taumalolo in the Tongan side, there's a chance of them winning it. And that would just which would be sort of pretty disastrous for the World Cup, I think, because it would for New Zealand anyway, because it would put them, I think, in their semi-final. If I'm trying to remember rightly, they might have to go to play it in Australia rather than over here, which would be not good for ticket sales. But I think that's probably the only one. You'd think with Wayne Bennett and England, England, that they'd be too good to lose to any of the Minnow nations as well.
Yeah, and with Papua New Guinea, do you think that they have a good chance to get into the semi-finals?
I can't remember off the top of my head who they left to play against. I'm not sure who would they play in the quarterfinals. I haven't looked at the draw.
They'll play the second team in Group A, I believe.
Right, okay. Well, that probably would be England then, wouldn't it? You'd imagine. Yeah, I can see them putting number 5, but I'd still sort of say England would be too strong for that. I think it's I guess it's a very good English side. They managed to lead. It's so good that someone like Sam Tompkins, who was won the Man of Steel a couple of years ago, couldn't make it in. So I still don't think that Papua New Guinea would be good enough to beat England, to be honest.
Yeah, okay. And with the tournament, in terms of New Zealand and their chances, how do you like their squad coming into the tournament?
It's well, I think it's an impressive squad, even with the players missing. I still think there's a lot of depth there. I guess a lot of pressure will go on Tamari Martin. He seems to be the guy who'll get the nod to play in the halves with Sean Johnson. Obviously, Tamari had a very good sort of second half of the season with the Cowboys, replacing Jonathan Thurston. But it's a big step up for him to now go and lead the Kiwis in such an important position during the World Cup. It seems to be that he'll be the one at 5'8", and Thomas Lulawai will go into hooker. So it's a lot of experience around him. But I think that there will be sort of bit of pressure on him during the tournament.
And in relation to the Anzac Test earlier in the year, where Australia won quite handily in the end, well, they got a pretty good start, which they maintained a pretty decent lead throughout. What can we make of that game in respect to, say, a potential Australia-New Zealand final?
I think it says that could well be the same thing that happens again, really, to be honest. Not trying to put the World Cup down too much, but it's Australia are just far way much better than the Kiwis. One thing you do hear, though, with the Kiwis, and it's fairly true, that they do sort of build into tournaments. They're not a side that's ever sort of traditionally done well in the one-off. Their Anzac Test record is dreadful. But if you think back to the 2015 Four Nations, when they had which they won over in Wellington, and also 2008 World Cup, obviously, which they won in Brisbane. They've got track record of getting better over a tournament, and it's interesting that they haven't done much training. They only sort of started training this squad sort of late last Friday, and they decided not to have any warm-up games either. So they're going to go in pretty cold to the game against Samoa, which could be slightly worrying for them. But that sort of thing, if they're going to rest, then it could sort of work up to peaking towards a potential final down in December.
Yeah, and with New Zealand, they've got Samoa, Scotland and Tonga in Group B. Who are the three teams you believe will progress through that group?
You'd say New Zealand, Samoa and Tonga, really. I don't know too much about the Scotland side. I've had a look through. There's a few names there they recognise, but overall, it's a squad made up of I guess sort of fringe Super League players or players based in England. I don't think they'll have the depth or the sort of the skills to sort of match it with Samoa and Tonga. I think that they did very well in the last World Cup. Scotland, and they were one of the sort of success stories of the sport, and obviously they played in the Four Nations a couple of years ago, and they're ready to draw against the Kiwis, which is one of the low points of rugby league in New Zealand over the last decade or so. But there's been plenty of them. But I still sort of can see Samoa and Tonga both beating Scotland.
Okay, and in terms of what you mentioned just then with the Super League in England, how does the quality of that competition compare with the NRL?
I think I actually had a chat with Peter Hiku the other day, who's just come back from Warrington and is going to be at the Warriors next year, about that. I said, how do you think the two leagues compare? And he said he sort of felt it was a very big difference between the NRL and Super League. He said by the time he got there, it was only sort of the middle-late part of their competition, so he wasn't playing against the likes of Wigan or Leeds or St Helens, the really big teams. But he sort of found it not too much of a high quality sort of competition compared to the NRL. And I think that's sort of the thing that you do hear over time is that in the NRL you've got a tough game, every round for 26 weeks. Where over there you'd have half your games would be against other really tough teams, and the others you're expected to win pretty easily. I think that's the big positive of the NRL is that I guess you could say the Knights weren't very good this year, but they still were competitive a lot. I think that's the difference is that the NRL is just a competition with so much more depth.
Mm. And in terms of the tournament as a whole, if you can name a few key players to look out for any casual fan who wants to watch the rugby this week and onwards?
Yep. I'm sort of trying to think of players who are sort of, I feel would sort of fit that sort of role. I mean, I guess in the Kiwis you'd say Sean Johnson. He's had an injury sort of plagued season and struggled in a team that didn't do very well in the Warriors this year. But he's had a good rest, and he's always very passionate about playing for the Kiwis. And I think he'll have a very good tournament. Clearly, you'd have to look at the guys like Cooper Cronk and the other Melbourne Storm guys in the Australian team. They're obviously going to go well. And you got to say Tamalolo as well, really, haven't you? He's going to be one of the stars of the tournament. And it will be interesting to see what sort of reception he gets in New Zealand, whether he gets booed or whether it's polite applause when he runs into the field.
Mm-hmm. And your two semi-finalists, who would you say?
Even though despite the Kiwis being all the issues which they've had, I still think they'll beat England in one of the semis, and I think they'll play Australia in the final, and then lose quite badly again, I'd say. Okay,
yeah. And who do you think Australia will play in their semi?
I think. I'm not sure. I haven't looked at the draws for the quarterfinals. I mean, I could see them playing. It depends who gets each other in the quarters, but I could see them. If I'm thinking of who's the fourth best team in this World Cup, you'd have to say Tonga now. I think so. Traditionally Samoa, do better than Tonga, and also Fiji as well. But I just think. I don't know. Yeah, I'd say probably Tonga, but there is sort of holes in that side as well. Although they've got some very good players. Papua, obviously, example is another good player in that side. But I think they might just get there.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll find out. And just touching on a few other New Zealand sporting interests over the weekend, we saw in the Bledisloe Cup the Australians get a win over the All Blacks. Would you say that, given the Aussies in the Union have beaten the All Blacks, which is their domain for New Zealand, that and a result like this could occur the other way around come the Rugby League World Cup?
No, I don't think so. I think I was an interesting sort of feeling over here. I think about that Wallabies win over the All Blacks is that not too many people are that disappointed by it. I think people have become a bit blasé, but they just sort of lost interest maybe slightly in the All Blacks to play against other sides because they always win, and it's never really. I think they obviously always want to beat Australia, but they would also like Australia to be competitive, to have some good tests, and the two tests this year have both been fantastic tests. But I don't think it was too much despondency about the All Blacks losing that one. And I think if it was the Bledisloe Cup decided the other night, it would have been a lot more gnashing of teeth about it. But I think overall, people weren't that bothered or disappointed, I'd say.
Yeah, I get you. And in the V8s yesterday, we saw a terrific race there with Scotty McLaughlin getting up. What's your take on the race and the supercars in general?
Yeah, I think it's from a New Zealand point of view, it's been a fantastic season to see the three guys up there all doing so well. I don't. When it comes to which one I think most New Zealanders would like to win, I'd say it's fairly split. Van Gisbergen's very popular, so is Coulthard, and Scott McLaughlin's he's such a pleasant guy to deal with from a media point of view, and I think that comes across from New Zealand public as well. They can see he's a good guy, and it's sort of what the results over in the Gold Coast really do set up the next round in Pukekohe in a couple of weeks' time, where the championship's not going to be won, but it's going to have a huge say in which way it goes.
Yeah, with 5 drivers within less than 200 points of each other, with the amount of races left, all of those guys are a real chance to take the title.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. I think Shane and Chaz Mostert will probably be outside. They need one of the other three to have a bit of bad luck and to get no points from a race. Although from a New Zealand point of view, I'd clearly like to see Fabian Coulthard or Scott McLaughlin win it. I do have that sort of nasty feeling about Jamie Whincup, just sort of stealing it at the end and just doing enough to come through and win it. And as I was watching it yesterday, Shane Van Gisbergen is such a great driver, but he didn't really seem to try and ever put any pressure on Whincup when he was behind him, and other times you see Shane really sort of go for it and take all the risk he can to win a race. But he didn't seem to do that. He seemed to be quite content to finish behind Jamie and let him get a bit more points than the other guys yesterday.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, given their teammates. Looking at the passing move Scotty did to get past Jamie as Jamie was getting out of the pits, what did you make of that?
Yeah, I was watching. I thought, he could be in trouble here. I mean, if he did turn in, there's a chance that they could have crashed into each other, and I guess that would be sort of one of the offences about what he did. But obviously got away from it, and I just think that any sort of issue that there could have been about, whether he should have been penalised for that, sort of came to an end when you saw, I think, on that lap, or further on that lap, Jamie did something similar at the hairpin, didn't he? He sort of went straight through it rather than come through, So, although obviously if he didn't have it in the first place, then Jamie would have been in the lead over Scott. So, but I thought the two incidents sort of cancelled each other out, and so I think it was pretty fair that they didn't penalise McLaughlin for it. But I was sort of worried that they were going to.
Yeah, there's an interesting one. And one other event for New Zealand overnight was New Zealand defeating India in the first one-dayer. What's been the take there in New Zealand after such a great win?
Well, I'm not sure much. I mean, it's a public holiday over here today. It's Labour Day, so it's all a bit quiet. But I think it's everyone, who sort of see it, and you heard people on the radio this morning talk about it. It was quite an impressive win to beat India over there in India. It doesn't happen too often, especially for this Black Cap side who have struggled in when they've been overseas in the last few years. It's a very good win, but obviously it's only early in the series. But we'll gladly take that as well. And I think another sort of big sort of sporting event yesterday from a New Zealand point of view was the Breakers very comfortably beating Melbourne in the NBL. They've won 3 games in a row now, the Breakers, and I think the sort of signs are that it could be a good year, and I think a lot of people are starting to take a little notice of how they could do this season.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, especially with Melbourne United coming into the season as firm favourites. It's great to see for the tournament, for the competition, and for New Zealand.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, it's only obviously I think team competition, can sort of, has its issues about keeping interest going or whatever. But it's certainly been a great start for the Breakers. The 2 imports that they've got in this year, DJ Newbill and Edgar Sosa, have both been outstanding. Both look really, really good gets for the team.
Yeah, for sure. And from a boxing perspective, what's the take on Joseph Parker from New Zealanders? I'm sure he must be a very popular man.
Yeah, completely. Yeah. He's very popular. It's he's one of the leading sports stars. I guess one of the interesting things though with Joseph Parker is that we have over here the Halberg Awards, which is our sort of Sportsperson of the Year awards. And even though last year he became heavyweight world champion, he sort of was never really in the running for it. And I just wonder whether this year he might be slightly more looked at more favourably. But I still don't think that he would be sort of up there. It's just interesting that I guess I don't know if the public think regard him very highly, but the judges don't. But he doesn't sort of. I don't know, from an elite sport point of view, he doesn't sort of get the recognition over here that he perhaps deserves.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I guess he hasn't yet had that big fight in the States yet, despite his last fight was in England. So maybe it might take something like that to capture a bit more of the public's attention.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. One of the Anthony Joshua, isn't there? The guy from Britain. If he has a fight against him, or if he does have a big payday fight in America, clearly that will sort of raise his profile even higher.
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of your involvement for the Rugby League World Cup, what will your role be over the next 6 weeks?
Yeah, I'll be at I'll be at the game on Saturday night, and then a couple of other Kiwis games over here in New Zealand, and then semi-final, and then over for the final in Brisbane in December. So I'll be pretty fully involved in it again, which is good.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm sure it'll be fun. And in terms of keeping up to date with all things David Long, what's the best way for our listeners to keep in touch with you on social media?
You can catch me on Twitter, which is David Long FFX, or you can see my stories, which will be all on the Stuff website, stuff.co.nz, which is the Fairfax, which is Fairfax over here in New Zealand, their website.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, fantastic. And yeah, it's certainly been great to chat, David. Thanks for giving all your insight into not only the Rugby League World Cup, but also other key events happening in New Zealand sport. And just before we go, what can you share with us in terms of the women's part of the competition for the Rugby League World Cup?
Well, not too much really. It hasn't really got much of attention over here. I know they named the squad a few weeks ago. I think the fact that it's the whole tournament is going to be played in Australia means that it's not going to get very much profile really, which is very unfortunate to say. But I think it's going to very much sort of slip under the radar in terms of a sporting event here in New Zealand.
Okay, no, that's interesting. So thanks once again, David, and we certainly have enjoyed your time today.
Yeah, no problem at all. Anytime. Thanks very much.
Excellent to chat to David. I personally cannot wait for the New Zealand-Tonga game. That is going to be intense. Also, great to hear David's thoughts on such a wide range of New Zealand sporting topics. They are our two guests for this week. I think it's safe to say that both Josh and David believe Australia will win the Rugby League World Cup quite handily. But make sure you tune in to see how it all goes, as I'm sure there'll be plenty of exciting football to be played over the course of the next 5 weeks. There is also the Women's Rugby League World Cup that will occur, starts on November 16, so about 3 weeks after the opening game of the men's tournament. So stay tuned for that as well. To buy tickets to the Rugby League World Cup, head to www.ticketek.com.au. Thank you for listening, and to our guests, Josh Massoud and David Long, for joining us this week. To keep up to date with the Sports Bar Life, subscribe to the show and follow us on Twitter and Facebook to keep up to date with all our future episodes. We cover major sporting events on a weekly basis, so I'm sure there'll be another event that you're interested in very soon. Enjoy the World Cup. Till next time.